Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about obedience and I'm going to talk about one of the more famous studies in psychology, the Milgram experiment. And I put this cute picture of the dog on here being obedient because it is kind of what we think about when we think about obedience, and this is where the dog is obeying an authority figure. It's obeying its owner, doing what the owner is asking it to do. And that's truly what obedience is. And when we talk about it in psychology, it's exactly the same thing. Um, but when we're talking about it as human beings, what we're talking about is, obeying an authority figure. As humans, we obey authority figures. And Stanley Milgram in 1963 did a famous study called the Milgram experiment. And he wanted to test how obedient people would be when they're asked to harm another person by an authority figure. And his question was really about Nazi Germany. So this was fairly soon after World War II, and he wanted to really understand, were the Nazi soldiers inherently evil? Were they just bad people that were willing to do these bad things? Or were they the average person that sort of got wrapped up in a really bad situation and they were obeying an authority figure? So he designed a pretty fancy experiment to question this. Were the Nazi soldiers merely monsters, or do we all have this potential to harm others given the right circumstances? So this is another example of the dark side of human nature. Would you shock a man with a known heart conditioning who's screaming and asking to be released? Would you continue to shock somebody knowing that they have a heart condition, hearing that they're screaming because you were told to by somebody in authority? So this is the experiment in a nutshell that he set up, and there's a good video about it as well. So what Milgram did was he hired a guy to be an actor, and this actor was called the learner, and he was told he was a volunteer, and he was told to explain that he had a heart condition, to yell and to scream when the person supposedly shocked him. He was never actually getting shocked, but he was to act like he was getting shocked. And so the goal of this experiment to tell the volunteer. So the learner was the actor, the teacher was the actual volunteer. And so the volunteer comes in and he's told that his job is to teach this learner, this person, these word pairs, and that if the person gets the word pair wrong, they're supposed to shock them. And they're telling the volunteer that, from learning theory and behavioral theory, when people get punished, they learn better. And so that was the goal of the experiment. And this man in a white coat tells them, what to do and how to use this shock machine, and that anytime the learner misses a word pair, then he's supposed to shock them. So the learner's attached to the shock machine. The volunteer can actually see this person behind the shock machine, and the the volunteer is told to shock this person when he makes a mistake. And the person that's the volunteer, that's the teacher, really believes that they're actually shocking this person. He's a pretty good actor. He's acting like he's being shocked, and he's yelling in pain and grabbing at his heart, saying, his heart hurts because of the shocks. So what happened was, Milgram, when he designed this experiment, really felt human nature was pretty good, and he felt like only about 1% of people would actually comply with the shocks. And what do you think he actually found? So this is what the machine looked like to the person. So when the person gets the first answer wrong, they just get a small, slight shock. And then as the person continues to miss questions, the shock level goes up and up and up and up, all the way to the very end where it's intense shock. So he predicted only 1% of the subjects or volunteers actually would comply with the shocks. But actually 65% of the people, that's more than half, obeyed by going all the way up to 450 volts. So they had to shock the person all the way along. I don't know how many buttons are there, but probably 20 or so. Even after the person went silent, even after that actor went silent and didn't answer any more questions, he was told to continue to shock that person. And 65% of the people went all the way up to 450 volts. Pretty crazy. So Milgram concluded from his study that good people are actually willing to harm another person when they're told to by to do so by a person in authority. So a lot of times when people are told to do something by someone in authority, they feel like it's not their responsibility anymore. It's that authorities, it's that person that told you to do that's responsibility. It's not your personal responsibility anymore. So Milgram did find that people are you don't take that same responsibility when they're told to do something by someone in authority. One of the things that we did look at was, what other factors are involved in obedience. There were, 35% of people that didn't go along, and what might have separated those people from the people that actually did shock the person all the way up to 450 volts. So one of the things that in the original experiment, the learner and the volunteer were separated by a partition, like by a window, or I don't know exactly what this partition is, but they weren't actually physically close enough to touch that person, but they could see the other person. They could see and hear the other person as well. But what if the person was right next to that person and could see and feel that person actually, or feel like they could see that person reacting to those particular shocks? And they found that if the person were physically close to the other person, that they wouldn't continue to do the shocking. But if they were separated, they were much more willing to shock that person. So you're kind of separated from the actions. If you think about it, if you're stabbing somebody versus shooting somebody with a gun, it's much easier to separate yourself from that violence when you're using a gun because there's a distance between you and the victim. So the more distance between you and the victim, the easier and the more obedient people will be. What about the researcher? What about the authority figure? If that authority figure was standing right behind the person saying, you need to continue, keep going, the person was much more likely to obey. But if the researcher was off in a different part of the university and wasn't there standing by, oftentimes the person that was the volunteer did continue to shock because they thought this is wrong and I'm not going to do it. But if there's authority figures right there, people tend to just go along with that authority people. And people really do rationalize that they're not personally responsible if somebody in authority is telling them to do something. And you got to think about it, people in the military, in combat kind of situations, often they are told by superior officers to do something that they may not feel comfortable with or feel like is the right thing to do, and yet they have to do it because if they don't do it, they will, be court-martialed, in trouble. So there are real reasons why people do obey authority. And in this situation, it's kind of a milder situation. If you think about it, the Nazi soldiers, they had authority figures right behind them that were perfectly willing to kill them if they didn't go along with the program. So the consequences of not obeying were pretty severe and often can be in our own military members. And, at work, you have to obey that authority figure. If your boss tells you to do something that you don't agree with or you don't think is the right thing to do, you still do it because if you don't do it, you're going to lose your job and you need that job. So there are a lot of good reasons why people do obey authority. And there are reasons why people have difficulty not obeying authority as well. And then, if other people join you in refusing to harm other people, then other people are more likely to join that group and less likely to, and more likely to resist orders. But, we're definitely obedient, and our society is set up so that we do obey authority figures. And so Milgram definitely concluded that the Nazi soldiers weren't just monsters, that they were your normal, average, everyday people that were sort of turned into monsters by these authority figures who probably really were monsters and, who forced them to do some pretty horrific things. So, and he said that we're all kind of vulnerable to this sort of a situation. And depending on how dire that situation is, the more willing we are to do bad things that we don't agree with. So there's a lot of ethical questions about Milgram study. It has actually been replicated by many other countries and many other times, but it's not an experiment that we would do today because participants certainly could be harmed by this study. When those people were finished with this study and recognizing that, man, I shocked that person, um, they could feel pretty bad about that. Becoming aware of your own human weaknesses and your willingness to go along with authority and actually harm someone is pretty terrible. It's a pretty horrible realization to come to. And participants should have been debriefed after this study and explained, what the study was about. And they were not necessarily, it wasn't something that was thought about at this time frame, but the study would not be allowed today because it could have been psychologically harmful to other people. Um, so that's it about the Milgram study, and there's a great video about the Milgram study that I would highly recommend watching that goes into more detail about the study and really explains his theories and this idea that we all have potential to become monsters, to become evil. Sad.